let's unpick this idea of the crowd a bit, because I think, well, when I look at it, I think there were two things going on. I think it's become quite fashionable to talk of the public as the crowd, and I think it's over the political disruptions of the past few years in Britain and America, and you see it around Europe, to sort of kind of blame everything on kind of these misguided people who don't know what they do. Now, I generally have a sense that the public knows better in many cases than politicians about how to deal with kind of big political decisions. And when I look at Sweden, I think what happened with Sweden was that they took the public with them. There was a much less politicised idea of the medical advice, the scientific advice, and there was a sense of trust in people in being able to manage themselves and manage this situation. The COVID moment comes back to what you were saying at the beginning, where you have people who are kind of fearful, so that drives the kind of increasing atomisation, and then you end up with people sort of stuck at home watching the news, doom scrolling on their phones, young people on social media and detached from each other. And that seemed to be a very kind of a strange thing there, where it's almost like that, what you describe as a crowd mentality, I think became detached from the public as the public, if you like. And it just sort of, it was presented all the time as this demand for more by, government and ministers, the demand for more rules, which then became self-perpetuating.
I think you have a good point there, and it's more than self-perpetuating, because the government then started to fuel it themselves. Having made that pivot and decided that they were going to go for a lockdown, then they actually not merely imposed a lockdown. Initially they said for 3 weeks to prepare the NHS, but in reality they actually then fueled the crowd's fear. Somebody fed those press stories of people dying in their 20s and 30s from COVID. And I can remember day after day, the Sun, the Daily Mail, other newspapers carrying such stories. And yet those deaths were incredibly exceptional. The average age of death through that March, April, May 2020 was low 80s. The people who died young were absolutely exceptional. But again and again, that message was ramped out that it was a threat to everybody. I candidly was not very compliant throughout with the COVID regulations. I've homes in Norwich and London, and I rattled backwards and forwards between them. And I would take the London tube, absolutely empty, half-lit, ghost-like, and I would listen to these plaintive messages on station platforms. My mummy is a nurse, and she is going to work to help and cure COVID patients, but you must, or everyone else must stay away from the railways and the tube because that makes it safer for my mummy to go to work. And this is industrial grade propaganda. It really annoyed me, but I have a fairly thick skin on such matters. Yes. But I'm sure it frightened lots and lots of people away, or essentially pricked their conscience to a point where they wouldn't travel. And later we had all those notices on bus shelters saying of the man with a mask on in the ICU, intubated rather, and say, look, can you look him in the face and say that you'll take risks? And again, it annoyed me. Intensely. I thought it was deeply immoral, and I thought it was scientifically flawed as well.
Yes, and the kind of official promotion of fear has been quite well documented by now. I mean, it was clearly no accident.
Absolutely.
But also, in my view, totally unnecessary, because people were frightened, which I don't think was irrational that people were frightened, but that kind of taking it onto that level of scaring, for example, young people in order to get them to comply, and also in order to show that something was being done. I mean, that's where I found the whole thing particularly disturbing. I think the government politicised the pandemic through this kind of idea of the need to... there seemed to be this idea what the public wants is for us to create rules, and then became that kind of attempt to try and get political support for more and more rules. And it became something that seemed to me a very strange thing to do in a democratic society.
I think it was a self-propelled machine. The government produced rules, the press, and to a degree the crowd demanded more rules. And this went absolutely against the plans that I saw for pandemic influenza when I worked for Health Protection Agency, which always said, and the plan that was still in place in 2020 was the 2011 pandemic influenza plan, which said you try to keep the public as calm as possible and you try to keep life going on as normally as possible. And all this was abandoned rather than trying to damp down people's fears. Instead, people's fears were ratcheted up by the government. And yes, it was a politicisation in a way. It wasn't a left-right politicisation. No. It was, if anything, a libertarian, an authoritarian versus libertarian. And I have a lot of sympathy for the people who argue that technocracy has become another sort of authoritarianism, which I find deeply concerning.